speaker.
See, there's protocol here. There's no difference between the professional and non-professional speaker, and I got notes. Candace Keynes is an independent historian and museum consultant. She's been researching former slaves who came to Maine after the Emancipation Proclamation. And these include a small group of former slaves who became the first black residents of Lewiston. They came here through the Freedmen's Bureau, whose Commissioner, General O.O. Howard, is a very familiar name to us. She's a former newspaper reporter and editor in Ohio and in Maine, and holds a doctorate in American history from the University of New Hampshire. She's taught history and women's studies at Bates College, Lewiston Auburn College, the University of Southern Maine, the University of New England, and for many years at the Maine College of the Arts. She's a past curator of the Maine Memory Network and the Maine Historical Society, where she held that post for over 12 years. We are truly honored to have her with us, Candace Keynes.
So I'm going to stand here because I don't have a remote. So get rid of that off the screen and get rid of this. So I'm delighted to be here. It's a little scary to come to the Androscoggin Historical Society and talk about Lewiston history to people who might know more than I do, but hopefully not about what I'm talking about right now. But what I am hoping is that after I talk, you will maybe have some ideas of things that can help me, as this is a work in progress. I started about 3 years ago. I curated the Civil War exhibit at the Maine Historical Society, and somebody said, you know, why don't you have any black soldiers in it? And I said, well, because there's no stuff. And you have to have stuff. So you can put it in, you know, you can put a label that talks about it, but you need some stuff. And so I started looking to see, you know, what else was out there, and it sort of snowballed. And here I am, 3 years later, still feeling like I'm in the early stages of trying to figure out what the story was with former slaves who came to Maine after the Civil War. On April 7th, 1906, a paragraph in the Of Local Interest column in the Lewiston Evening Journal began, 40 years ago Friday, the first colored people came to Lewiston from the South. The article described a small party organized by Robert Creart to observe the occasion. Besides Creart, the article named only Alonzo Garcelon, who induced them to come, and William Davis and Benjamin Grice, calling the two former slaves fine folk, honest, industrious, frugal, and of good purpose. Grice had died some years ago, but Davis was still working on, a faithful man in every relation. The article concluded, it was a good day when they came to Lewiston. In April 1866, when the former slaves arrived, the Civil War had been over for about a year, and the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, known as the Freedmen's Bureau, was fighting for its continued existence, even as it continued to help former slaves from throughout the slave-owning states find employment. And the Freedmen's Bureau made contracts with the employers, whether they were former plantation owners or, I'm assuming, people in Lewiston, Auburn, although I haven't seen those particular contracts. General Oliver Otis Howard, as you know, a native of Leeds, headed the Bureau, and his brother, General Charles Howard, ran the district office in Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia, Maryland. Thousands of formerly enslaved men, women, and children who had left plantations to find freedom as soon as the Union armies began arriving in the Washington area and farther south, made their way to Washington, D.C. And they continued to make their way to the Washington, D.C. area because it was really the headquarters of the Army, the Union Army in the Virginia area, and it was closer to the north. So Washington, D.C. was a very popular spot for former slaves who were escaping from plantations and even after the war to find their way there. There were not enough jobs, housing, or other services for the huge influx. So by 1866, Washington was really crowded, and the Freedmen's Bureau, among others, was trying to figure out what to do with all of the people who were there. They essentially set up an employment bureau to find positions not just for the people in Washington, but for any of the 4 million newly freed slaves who needed their help. In the Washington, D.C. district, employment agents worked with Freedmen's Aid societies and other charitable groups, placed ads in newspapers, and responded to individual requests for workers, industrial, household, farm, men, women, and children, and transported a number of those refugees to the north. They also, from that bureau, placed people in the south, but that was the major place that sent former slaves north. Lewiston, at the time, already was a manufacturing mecca with a growing population, from 3,500 people in 1850 to 13,600 in 1870. Manufacturing jobs were the draw for people moving into the city, and in Lewiston, as in many other places in Maine and throughout the Northeast, farm workers and household workers were in very short supply, due in part to the lure of manufacturing jobs, in part to the lure of Western developing states who were trying to recruit people so that they would have enough population to become states, partly in part due to the lure of gold in the West, and in part due to Civil War deaths. So there was a real labor shortage in certain areas, farms, households. Even before the war ended, Otis Howard had brought former slaves he met at Union encampments to Maine to work for family members. A young woman and her 2 children to help his wife, Lizzie, in Augusta. Another young woman to help his brother, Roland, and his wife, Ella, in Farmington. And a man who became connected to the Lewiston-Auburn community, who you probably know about, George Washington Camp, to work on Howard's widowed mother's farm in Leeds. I estimate that at least 300 former slaves settled in Maine in the years following from emancipation to the following the end of the Civil War. Some came with individual soldiers they met, some through the Freedmen's Bureau employment transport system, and a few on their own. This study of the LA community, as I've said, is part of a larger work in progress, but my study of Lewiston-Auburn is also a work in progress. So I'm going to share with you what I know now, and it might get a little confusing because I'm going to talk about individually some of the stories of the estimates are 12 to 15 people arrived on that day in April, or a few days maybe in April of 1866. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about each of those people, and it'll probably sound like about 40 by the time I'm done, and how they were connected and how they worked to create a community, small though it was in this area. On March 16, 1866, the Freedmen's Bureau recorded receipt of a letter dated March 12th from Alonzo Garcelan in Lewiston, seeking 1 house servant and 1 man for stable work and a man and wife to use on the farm. He also asked for 2 or 3 female house servants and as many males for whom he would secure places. The same day, the Bureau recorded a letter dated March 14th from Uriah Balcom in Lewiston, seeking a colored boy for stable work and a girl 15 years old. J.V.W. Vandenberg, who was superintendent of the employment office for the Freedmen's Bureau in Washington, assigned a man named Mr. Clark to accompany some of the former slaves to Lewiston. Garcelan sent another letter dated March 17th, noting that Balcom would accompany Mr. Clark and an unspecified person or persons from Washington to Maine. Less than a month later, Lewiston's first black residents arrived. Garcelon, as you know, was a physician, Maine Surgeon General during the Civil War, a founder of the Lewiston Journal, and a politician. And I used to work for the Lewiston Journal, by the way, one of my many careers. He certainly knew the Howards, and his request probably got some special attention, like picking particular people to come who he had met or knew about. Balcom, a minister at the Congregational Church in Lewiston, had served as chaplain for the 16th Maine in late 1863 and 1864, and later was a professor at Bates College. He no doubt got to know refugees from slavery during his Civil War service, and may have been why he also was actively recruiting former slaves to come here. After Balcom's death in 1874, he was thrown off a horse, so he died in 1874. The editor of the Bates Student, the newspaper there, wrote that he had a liberality of spirit and freedom from all forms of bigotry. Robert Creart, who organized the observance that I mentioned at the beginning in 1902, told a newspaper reporter in 1927 that one vivid impression of the group's arrival was that Lewiston was just a mud hole. He recalled that a number of area residents met the former slaves at the depot, but that on their way to their new homes, an Irishman threw stones at them. Creart and the others he mentioned in the short anniversary notice, Ben Bryce and William Davis, and Davis's wife Anna, all worked for Garcelon. Others may have as well of the group that came. And I have not yet determined what happened to those Balcom requested, or where all of the people I know were the first people to come worked when they first got here. Several of the 15 or so new arrivals were the subject, fortunately, of feature stories in the Lewiston Journal, especially over the years. For instance, the Evening Journal on May 16, 1883, carried a story about the illness of one of the best-known faces about town, Benjamin Grice, the faithful colored janitor of the Pine Street Congregational Church, and by unanimous consent, the politest man in Lewiston. Daniel Benjamin Grice was born a slave in Maryland in about 1840. In 1862, he escaped from his master by night and walked 35 miles to Union Lines in Washington. And the greatest majority of the former slaves who came here were born in Virginia. It doesn't mean that that's where they spent their lives as slaves necessarily, but they probably did, and because of the proximity to Washington. When Grice came to Lewiston, he first worked on Garcelon's father's farm, but he became lonesome, the newspaper reported, and went to Garcelon's home, where he worked for 6 years, and later worked for Colonel Fry. Garcelon asked Grice, about 3 months after his arrival, how he liked living in the North. Grice responded that he would like it better if his folks were here. The newspaper article noted, this was the first intimation ever received that he had any people. His wife Martha and 2 sons were sent for, and the Freedmen's Bureau transported them to Lewiston in July 1866. So as happened with many former slaves, they became separated either before the war started by being sold off plantations or whatever, being sold by their owners and going somewhere else, or during the war they became separated for a number of reasons that I won't go into, but it happened with a number, I think, of the people in this group and with lots of other people that I know about. When Grice died in 1886, the paper ran another, 1886, excuse me, the paper ran another story. It detailed some of Grice's history, including being sold 3 times while a slave, and noted, he was a well-informed, intelligent man, honest, reliable, exceedingly deferential, and much respected. He was the ideal of a ceremonious plantation valet. The story of his life, as told by him, was a romance of Dixie. The Grices eventually started a house cleaning business specializing in rug beating. And he was sexton, as I've said, of the Pine Street Congregational Church. Their son Daniel, born a slave in 1862, was the third black person to graduate from Bates College in 1883. He became a teacher and lawyer, but died in 1887 in Richmond, Virginia. 1 year after his brother Frank, then a junior at Bates, died, and his father died also, both in 1886. Martha Grice apparently had died earlier, although I haven't found the date of her death. By 1874, Grice and his family lived on Elm Street at the corner of Elm and Brooks, which is now Oak Street, in a house they owned at some point. I don't know when they bought it, but John Nichols and Robert Burrell, also former slaves, lived a few blocks away. In June 1876, Ben Grice, 41, remarried. His new wife, Hannah Brooks Dutton, was from New Brunswick. She had a son, Harry Dutton, who was born in Canada. She and her mother, Margaret, and sister Marguerite apparently came to the U.S. together. They also lived near the Grices at that spot, and I'm going to show you a map in a little bit.
Hannah Grice later married one of the Kemps. I don't
Yeah.
know if you had that in your
Oh
records
yeah,
or not.
you'll hear it that too. Just to confuse you, you're going to hear all of these twining interconnections. Marguerite, Maggie Brooks, the sister of Hannah Brooks Dutton, who married Ben Grice, married John Nichols, another of the first group in Lewiston. And they all lived near each other at that point. The journal Saturday Magazine on April 16, 1921, published a two-page feature on John Nichols, born a slave in North Carolina in 1848. He was 14 when he escaped in 1862 and survived the dismal swamp on his way to Union lines. The article noted, and most of the people he escaped with didn't make it, but he and several others did. The article noted that Nichols won the high regard of all our people with whom he has come into contact. Faithful, honest, and industrious, both he and his family have been admitted into the United Baptist Church, and there they are highly regarded by all its members. The reporter repeated almost the exact same sentiment later in the article, and you'll see that same language used over and over again in regard to the former slaves. Nichols told the reporter that Garcelon was anxious to get a colored man and woman to work on his farm. Some of his friends also wanted to get colored men. These were Dr. Kilbourne and Dr. Oakes of Auburn, Dr. Martin, and Dr. Bradford of Lewiston. The paper quoted Nichols as saying, "Garcelon was very kind to us when we reached Lewiston." Nichols also, this is a picture of John Nichols. Nichols said that he had worked for many people in Lewiston by 1921, and they all have used me well. He blacked stoves and did odd jobs for Colonel Ham and later Dr. Martin for 9 years before going into business for himself, cleaning houses and doing various other jobs. Nichols said, "It was a good thing for us to come to Lewiston, although I should like to go back to the old plantation once more before I die." Nichols and his wife Marguerite, known as Maggie, had 13 children, although only 3 were still alive in 1921, and they were raising one of their grandsons at the time. Maggie Nichols knew how to read and write. John Nichols, according to the 1900 census, knew how to read, but not to write. Robert Creart, who you've already met, was born in Richmond, Virginia, to parents who had, and he's the only person who came as part of this transport who had not been a slave, but they transported him anyway, was born in Richmond, Virginia, to parents who had purchased their freedom when they were young, he told the newspaper. He reportedly worked odd jobs in Washington, D.C., but he also